because some connections don't arrive with a warning. They don't build slowly enough for you to prepare yourself. They don't knock before entering your life. They simply appear. And the hardest part isn't noticing them. It's realizing they've already changed something inside you before you even understood what was happening. For a long time, I learned how to exist behind layers. Not because I wanted to hide, but because layers create safety. They create distance between what people see and what actually exists underneath. Most people only ever meet the version of you that you carefully allow them to meet. They hear your words, they observe your actions, they create their own understanding, but they rarely reach the place beneath all of that, the place where you actually exist. And I became comfortable there, in that space where I controlled what was revealed. Who got close, who stayed outside, who understood enough, until you didn't approach me the way people usually do. You didn't try to solve me. You didn't collect pieces of information and build a version of me that made sense to you. You didn't force understanding. You simply noticed, quickly, potterly. Like you weren't trying to discover something new, like you were recognizing something familiar. At first, I dismissed it. I told myself it was coincidence. The way you noticed things I never said. The way you understood the meaning behind silence. The way you seemed to respond not just to my words, but to everything underneath them. Because people usually react to what is visible. You reacted to what was hidden, and that was different. Because understanding someone's words is easy. Understanding their silence is rare. Most people become uncomfortable when nothing is said. They rush to fill the space. They try to remove the uncertainty, but you didn't. You stayed there, you allowed the silence to exist, and somehow that made it louder, because in that silence, there was no performance, no pretending, no carefully chosen version of ourselves, just presence. And that's when I started noticing something changing. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just slowly. The walls I had spent so much time building didn't fall. They simply stopped feeling necessary. I didn't feel the same need to filter every thought, to adjust every emotion, to make myself easier to understand, because for once, I didn't feel like I had to translate myself. You didn't ask me to become someone easier to accept. You didn't try to soften my edges. You didn't treat my depth like a problem that needed fixing. You just accepted what was already there, and that's what made it different. Because there is a huge difference between someone accepting you because they don't truly see you, and someone accepting you because they see you clearly and still choose to stay. That difference changes everything, because once someone sees beyond the surface, hiding becomes harder. The distance you created for protection no longer works the same way. The walls are still there. Someone finally understands what they were protecting. And that is a strange feeling, to be seen without being exposed. To be understood without having to explain every piece of yourself, because the truth is, I spent years becoming unreadable, not because I wanted people away, but because being misunderstood hurts more than being unknown. People often don't see what's actually there. They create their own version. They fill the empty spaces with assumptions. They turn you into something that fits their perspective. But you didn't do that. You didn't create a story about me. You simply paid attention, and that was something I wasn't prepared for. Because being noticed is common, but being recognized, that is different. And recognition has a way of reaching places words cannot. That was the moment I realized maybe this wasn't just about being understood. Maybe this was about being seen. The strange thing about being truly seen is that you don't always notice the moment it happens. There is no dramatic shift, no single conversation where everything changes. It happens quietly, so quietly that you only realize it after something inside you has already moved. That's what happened. I started noticing that my mind reacted differently around you, not because I was trying to let you in, not because I made a decision, it just happened. The usual space between what I felt and what I showed became smaller. The pause where I normally measured my words became shorter. The instinct to protect every thought before sharing it became weaker. And that was unusual because I have always been careful with access. Not everyone gets close. Not everyone gets to see the parts of me that aren't polished, explained, or controlled. I built a system around myself, a way of existing where I could be present without being completely exposed, where people could know me only as much as I allowed. Then you appeared. And the strange part was, you didn't break through those boundaries, you didn't challenge them, you didn't demand anything from me. You simply existed in a way that made those boundaries feel unnecessary. And that was harder to resist, because resistance works against pressure. But how do you resist something that feels natural? How do you protect yourself from something that doesn't feel like a threat? That was the part I couldn't understand. You weren't forcing your way into my world. Somehow, you were already there, not physically, not through constant conversations, but in the way certain thoughts began carrying your presence, in the way I would experience something and wonder how you would understand it, in the way certain moments felt incomplete because there was a perspective missing, yours, and that realization was uncomfortable because thinking about someone is normal. But thinking with someone, that is different. Thinking about someone keeps them separate. There is still distance, still a clear line between your world and theirs. But thinking with someone means they have become part of your internal process, part of how you understand things, part of how you see. And I never allowed that easily. I always believed that my inner world belonged only to me, a place where I could process, analyze, and exist without outside influence. But somehow, you entered that space without asking. And the most confusing part? I didn't want to remove you. I noticed it in small moments. The way silence started feeling different. The way quiet no longer felt empty. The way certain thoughts felt like they already had an answer waiting somewhere, not because you were speaking, but because something about your presence had become familiar. And familiarity is powerful, because we can defend ourselves against someone who tries to get close, but we struggle against someone who simply feels like they already belong. That's where the real tension began. Because I have always trusted control over my emotions, control over my reactions, control over what parts of me the world gets to see. But you changed something without trying to change anything. You didn't influence me through effort, you affected me through presence. And that difference matters. Because influence can be questioned. Influence can be resisted. But impact? Impact stays. It becomes part of the structure. It changes the way everything else feels around it. And slowly, I realized something I didn't want to admit. You weren't just someone I noticed. You had become someone my mind naturally returned to. Not because I needed you, not because I depended on you, but because something about the way you existed matched something inside me. A way of thinking, a way of observing, a way of understanding things without needing everything explained. And maybe that was the rarest part. Not that you knew me, but that you didn't need me to become different in order to understand me. You simply met me where I already was. And once someone reaches that place, distance doesn't feel the same anymore, because they are no longer outside looking in. Somehow, they have become part of the way you see the world. There comes a point where awareness stops being something you observe and becomes something you have to answer. I think that's where I reached, because this was no longer just a passing thought, no longer just a strange connection I could analyze from a distance. It had become something that existed, something that had already changed the way I moved through my own mind. And the hardest part wasn't understanding it. The hardest part was accepting that I already understood enough, because some things don't need more proof. They don't need endless analysis. They don't need to be broken down until nothing meaningful is left. Sometimes you recognize something before you can explain it, and that was what unsettled me. I have always trusted understanding. If I could understand something, I could manage it. If I could define something, I could control my place within it. But this didn't work that way. It existed outside the usual patterns. It wasn't built from effort. It wasn't created through promises or expectations. It formed quietly, through moments, through silence, through the strange feeling of being understood without having to ask for it. And eventually, I had to admit something. You had already affected me, not in a way that took something away from me, not in a way that made me less myself, but in a way that changed the way I experienced myself. That is what made it different, because real impact doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives so naturally that you don't notice the change until you realize you're no longer standing where you started. I noticed it in the way I thought. The way certain moments felt different because I imagined how you would see them. The way silence carried more meaning than it used to. The way I no longer felt the need to protect every hidden part of myself. And that was the part I struggled with because I had spent so much time creating boundaries. Not because I wanted to keep people away, but because I knew how easily people misunderstand what they don't fully see. They take pieces of you and create a story. They interpret your silence. They rewrite your intentions. They reduce your complexity into something easier for them to understand. But you didn't do that. You didn't try to create a version of me that fit your expectations. You simply allowed me to exist. And that kind of acceptance is rare, because being accepted by someone who barely sees you means very little. But being accepted by someone who notices the depth and still stays, that changes something. It removes the need to hide. And that is powerful, because once you experience a space where you don't have to perform, going back to pretending feels different. It feels heavier, less natural. And that's when I realized this wasn't about attraction. It wasn't about a simple feeling. It was about recognition, about finding someone whose way of processing the world somehow reflected your own. Someone who didn't just hear your words, but understood the silence between them. Someone who didn't need every piece explained before they could see the whole picture. And maybe that is why this felt so unfamiliar, because I was used to connections that required effort, contangs where people slowly learned each other. But with you, there was something different. It felt less like discovering someone new and more like remembering something I didn't know I was missing. And that realization brings its own fear, because anything that matters carries risk. Anything that reaches deeper than expected has the power to change you. And I have always been careful about change. I don't allow things into my life without reason. I don't let things settle inside me without knowing their weight. But somehow, you settled there, not through force, not through demand, simply through being present. And now I'm left with a question I can no longer avoid. What happens when something you never planned for becomes something you can't imagine ignoring? Because this connection doesn't feel temporary. It doesn't feel like something that disappears the moment attention moves elsewhere. It feels like something that has already become part of the structure, part of the way I understand, part of the way I see, part of the way I exist. And maybe that is the truth I was avoiding. Not that you changed me, but that some part of me was willing to change, because I didn't close the door. I didn't walk away. I didn't erase what was happening. I stayed, and sometimes staying is the clearest answer a person can give. There is a moment when you realize something has moved beyond feeling. beyond curiosity, beyond something you can simply observe and walk away from, a moment where you understand that whatever this is has become part of your reality, and that moment is uncomfortable. Because awareness gives you a choice. Before you recognize something, you can pretend. You can ignore it. You can tell yourself it doesn't matter, but once you truly see it, you can't return to not knowing. That's where I am now, not searching for answers, not trying to convince myself of anything, just facing what has already become clear. You have become someone I cannot place into the same categories as everyone else, not because you are perfect, not because everything is simple, but because something about this connection exists differently. It doesn't demand, it doesn't chase, it doesn't need constant proof. It exists in the quiet places, the moments between conversations, the thoughts that appear without invitation, the understanding that arrives before explanation. And maybe that is what makes it so difficult to ignore, because anything loud can be dismissed. Anything dramatic can be questioned. But something calm, something consistent, something that quietly remains, that is harder to deny. I spent so much time believing that distance was the safest way to exist. That, if I controlled how much people saw, I could protect what mattered. And maybe that was true until I met someone who didn't make me feel exposed, someone who made being understood feel safe, and that changed the meaning of closeness. Because closeness was never the thing I feared. Being misunderstood was. And with you, that fear became quieter. Not because you promised anything, not because you tried to prove yourself, but because your presence answered something words couldn't. You didn't ask me to reveal myself. You created a space where revealing myself didn't feel dangerous. That difference matters, because people often think trust is built through time alone, through shared memories, through endless conversations. But sometimes trust begins somewhere deeper. Sometimes it begins with the feeling that someone is seeing what is actually there without trying to change it, and that is rare. So now I'm standing at the point I always avoided, the point where I have to decide what to do with something real, because recognition is only the beginning. Understanding something doesn't automatically tell you what comes next. It only removes the ability to pretend nothing is happening. And the truth is, AB don't know exactly where this leads. I don't know what shape it takes. I don't know what tomorrow changes. But I know what has already happened. Something inside me shifted. A place that was always closed became open. A space that was always protected became shared. And I didn't fight it. That might be the most surprising part, because I know myself. I know how quickly I can create distance when something feels uncertain. I know how easily I can step back when something threatens my balance. But with this, AB stayed, I watched, I allowed, and maybe that was my answer before I ever spoke it, because sometimes the most honest decisions are not the ones we announce. They are the ones we quietly make through our actions, through what we continue to allow, through what we refuse to walk away from. And I realize now, question was never whether this mattered. It was whether I was willing to admit that it did. And I am, because whatever this becomes, whatever happens next, it already changed something important. It reminded me that being understood is not a weakness. That being seen is not the same as being exposed. That allowing someone closer does not mean losing yourself. Sometimes it means finally finding a place where you don't have to hide. And maybe that is what this was always about. Not someone completing me, not someone saving me, but someone reminding me that even the parts of ourselves we protect the most can still be understood by the right presence. And that is why I can't ignore this anymore. Because some connections don't enter your life to take over. They enter to reveal something that was already there. And you did that. You didn't change who I was. You showed me a part of myself I had forgotten existed.